Welcome to tonight's virtual Civil War presentation brought to you by CivilWarTalk.com. Thanks for joining us. Our guest tonight is Craig Swain on Civil War field artillery tactics. This series is provided by CivilWarTalk.com, the American Civil War discussion forum. We're happy to be able to bring these fantastic programs to you via the live virtual platform. If you're not already a member of Civil War Talk, we encourage everyone to become a member, and we'll provide some membership information a little bit later in the program.
Craig Swain is the author and genius behind the award-winning blog To the Sound of the Guns. He blogs from Leesburg, Virginia, and is an avid student of Civil War artillery. If you've ever performed a Google search for any Civil War artillery-related questions, the results likely included one or more of Mr. Swain's well-researched and informative blog posts. Mr. Swain is a graduate of Westminster College, Fulton, Missouri, with a BA in history. Commissioned in the Army after college, he served as both a combat arms and communications officer. After leaving the Army, he continued his studies at Missouri State University. He is the author of numerous articles appearing in Civil War Times, America Civil War, Artilleryman, and other magazines. His award-winning blog, recently relaunched To the Sound of the Guns, covers various aspects of the war, but with a focus on artillery and the Charleston theater of war. Mr. Swain is presently an information technology manager for the Internal Revenue Service. Please join me in welcoming Craig Swain.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Tina, and that good warm up there, Laura. Really excited to be here tonight presenting this to you. It's like, wow, I see the number of participants. I'll tell you, over the last year and a half, maybe 2 years, me personally, I've kind of worried that our old Civil War roundtable format might be suffering due to the effects of the pandemic, due to with social distancing and reducing in-person meetings. But I really like that organizations such as here Civil War Talk are bringing this to a different venue, the electronic, the social media, the virtual meeting, because this is we still need to come around and share the good news about the Civil War and talk about the history around the war and such, and it just helps helps us all generally as a country understand this. But you didn't come here to hear me philosophize. You came here to hear me talk about Civil War artillery, specifically a Civil War artillery tactics. So I hate to burn a cover slide, so I always want to give you something on any slide I put out here. And you got here the three classes of artillery here, out here as photographic examples. You got John C. Tidball leaning up against a 3-inch ordnance rifle. That's a gun. Of the cannon, the subclass here is it's a gun. Now, guns can be smoothbore or a rifle. This one happens to be a rifle. The difference between a gun and a howitzer over there, the color photo on the right, is a gun uses a heavy propellant charge or large propellant charge to fire a projectile on a relatively flat trajectory, usually to long range. Whereas the howitzer uses a moderately sized charge to fire a projectile, usually a shell, whereas guns will fire solid shot and such, solid shot and case. We'll go a bit more into these in a bit, but a howitzer fires it at a moderate range, but at a higher angle of trajectory, typically, again, a shell. And at the bottom there, a lot of people say, well, mortars weren't in the field artillery. Well, I'm going to show you at the end of the war, they were becoming reintroduced, probably is the best way to put it, reintroduced to the field artillery, because it had been in the field artillery in ancient times, was reintroduced to the field artillery during the Civil War, and we still have it today in our armies in the field artillery. A howitzer, or rather a mortar, is firing a shell at a very high angle with using a very small charge. It's kind of lofting that shell, and the aim is to get it over a terrain feature or a man-made object and such. So, but the reason I emphasize these, you're saying, well, hey, you're talking about the technology here. Well, the technology and the tactics kind of go hand in glove here. What we're going to see throughout history, and especially during the Civil War, an army will have its tactics, And as it's implementing its tactics, they'll come into problems. How do they solve the problems? They introduce technology to solve a tactical problem. And then from that, you'll refine the doctrine, the tactical doctrine, and come up with a better way of employing those weapons. And this cycle continues on over and over again. Problem solving is the evolution, the essence of the evolution of tactics. And these can, therefore, these are the tools of the trade. So as we think about this, as we approach the study of a Civil War battlefield, we need to think about, well, how these were used, how the commanders would mix and match these weapons, rifles, smoothbores, howitzers, mortars, and such, how they would mix and match these on the battlefield in order to achieve their mission. More importantly, where they would place them and what they would want that artillery to do at the position they placed it in. You know, not to knock on any other historians or stuff, but a lot of times we just don't have time in a battle study or a campaign study to go into the details. What made a good position a good artillery position? I mean, we'll walk the battlefield and say, hey, this is a good artillery position, but what made it a good position is not so much, hey, you got a good field of fire. Anybody can pick that out, but what the commander wanted to do from that point, how they wanted to influence the battle at that point. And that to me is the essence of tactics. You know, not to set aside, drill is an important facet of tactics very much. But what we're going to look at here tonight is where they placed the guns and why did they place the guns. But to do that, I've got to give you, got to walk you through some of the technology and the evolution of the arm a bit so we understand that. And when we talk about the evolution of the army from the American practice, we got to go back to the Revolutionary War. Yes, we inherited by and large our way of warfare from the Europeans, and through the colonial era and the Revolution, basically what we adapted the European methods to our terrain here in America. Much more broken terrain, much more heavily wooded, so it wasn't necessarily conducive to the European style of warfare. It had to be adapted. But the American use of artillery in the mid 1700s and early 1800s, it reflects this European doctrine. That is to say, the artillery is subordinate to the infantry on the battlefield, and it's largely there to provide depth of engagement. Most American field artillery in this era, they were guns. And guns of that time period could only fire solid shot and grape shot. Grape shot, much like our canister from the Civil War, it's a self-defense weapon or projectile, and so it's typically used just in those dire moments when the artillery pieces are hard pressed. Occasionally, you could use it offensively or to good effect there, but generally, it's a self-defense weapon. But the solid shot fired from a gun, let's think about this for a bit. If it's fired directly at me, I'm directly in front of it, I'm going to have a bad day. But if I'm 3 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet to the left or right of it, I can probably walk that off. It's not going to directly affect me. So the way I like to describe it is, in this era, the guns were almost being used like large muskets. They had 2, 3, 4, 5 times the range of a musket, but the what we would call today the fire effects, what happens on the receiving end, were very limited in such. And thus, what you'll see the Americans do, much like the Europeans were doing at the time period, use the artillery to open engagement, providing that depth to the battlefield, and then move them into a subordinate role to support that infantry line. And we see that kind of pattern in the larger battles, such as Monmouth during the war. But I'm going to take you to a North Carolina battlefield, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, March 15th, 1781, to illustrate how Americans were using artillery at the time. In this battle, the Americans bring 4 artillery pieces. They've got 4,500 infantry, give or take, a few hundred here, but 4 artillery pieces only. Now, 2 of these artillery pieces are sent forward. If you can see my cursor here, that blue arrow, they were sent forward to the first American line. If you're not familiar with this battle, just real briefly, General Nathaniel Greene, the first line he set, whereas basically they were militia, and he's following a tactical disposition similar to what was used effectively at the Cowpens. That behind this, they got a second and a third line of regular U.S. troops, or not U.S. by this time, American troops. And the idea was the militia would open the engagement briefly, maybe fire a volley or 2, and then fall back. And so the intent of the artillery here, these two field pieces, and they're very similar to the ones over here in the upper left. These are on display on the battlefield. They were located roughly where where I was standing for this photograph in the lower left, looking down this road. And the idea was they would fire on the British as they approached in column. That would force the British to deploy into line, commit to fighting the first American line, and start the battle to the Americans' choice, on the Americans' terms. Okay. And the artillery did that successfully. They did exactly what they were asked to do, did it successfully, and withdrew. They withdrew back here to the third line and set up shop there. Well, the rest of the battle doesn't exactly go to Greene's plan. If you study this, you know what happens in the end. General Cornwallis wrestles a Pyrrhic victory out of this. So it's an American defeat, but it's a hard contest for the British. And, you know, as you know, we don't stand up for God Save the Queen right now anymore. And so that means that this battle was a setup for Yorktown, which was an American victory. And if I'm going to mention Yorktown here, I will say that action, it was a siege, but it was the largest concentration of American artillery during the war. But it was a siege. So the reason I'm not mentioning Yorktown here is it's off our topic of field artillery tactics. Keep in mind here the ratios. I told you the Americans brought 4 guns to the battle, and they had 4,500 men. So less than 1 gun per 1,000 men. These ratios are important as we consider the tactics. What's the ratio of infantry to artillery? Because it reflects how the artillery is being used by the commanders. So that's what's happening on our side of the Atlantic. Well, what's happening concurrently over on the European side? Well, you've got the Napoleonic era emerging. Now, to really understand the evolution of artillery, you know, on the European continent, you got to understand there's 2 key differences here from our American experience and that European experience. First off, European conflicts are always going to feature much larger, more concentrated armies on terrain that is more conducive to grand maneuvers. Just flat this. That's the way that's the nature of fighting on the European continent. Secondly, we've got to consider the administrative evolution of the arm. The Americans skipped this process. We went straight to the artillery as a regular arm in the army. Instead, the Europeans had to evolve this. They started out prior to the 1700s. Their artillery they were companies. They were private companies, mercenaries, if you will. If a king wanted to go to war, he went out, he bought the services of an artillery battery or 2 or 5 or 10, and he put them in his army because these were specialists. These were people that had a very special skill set. Well, during the 1700s, the Europeans evolved to a regular standing artillery force. So by the late 1700s, you see uniformed soldiers armed with standardized weapons produced by the nation's foundries that are being led by trained artillerists. And one of those trained artillerists coming through the ranks at this time is a fellow by Napoleon Bonaparte, we've all heard of. And Bonaparte then is kind of he benefits from this if you will, the internalization of the artillery arm into the army. He learns about artillery at the battery level, at the support level, up all the way up through the army, and then as a commander. And this means now we have true doctrine, artillery doctrine, arriving that on the European battlefield, that it's designed to maximize the use of artillery. So to understand that framework as it's changing, we kind of got to understand the tactics. Yes, of the grand tactics, but first and foremost, the technology of the period, how it limits what they can do. You see here, I've got a photograph of a British 9-pounder field gun from 1812. You see, it's not too far off. I could have probably slipped in a picture there of a model 1841 American weapon, and you almost would be fooled by it. Very similar carriage, very similar layout. Well, they're smoothbore. These smoothbore guns, again, they fire round shot or solid shot, and they also fire grape shot. Now, and I'm sorry there that my picture down here in the lower right, a little pixelated. I need to fix that, but you get the idea. Grape shot stand of grape shot in the Napoleonic era. They began to see, well, as a scatter weapon, as a scatter projectile. Hey, it's great for nautical uses, but there's not enough submunitions for an infantry fight. And so they begin to transfer over to what we called it canister, what we are fully understand. Canister initially was just filled with a can filled with lead balls, but they gradually they realized that the lead balls were deforming in flight, so they would switch over to cast iron, and that, as we would use mostly during our American Civil War, that carried through. But it could fire that scatter weapon, but again, it was intended for the gun firing that. It's intended for short range self-defense is the primary usage there. Solid shot from the guns is their primary projectile. And the other type of projectile you'll see on the Napoleonic battlefield, you see there in the center right, it's the shell. The shell here, got to understand what was going on with shell. It was not used as much in the Napoleonic era as it would be in the Civil War. Well, why is that? Because there's some limitations. There's some technical limitations that prevent the artillerist from using it. Shell has got a great fire effect on the distant end. You drop a shell in amongst a formation of infantry, it doesn't just knock out the guys who are directly in front of it. It has concussive effects across that formation, much broader effects. So if you're looking for fire effects, you want to use a shell. But there's a problem here. First and foremost, the shells of this day, and this is one I believe was a picture of one that was recovered from the battlefield at Waterloo. The shell of the day, it uses a wooden plug. This plug, you put it in, you've got the gunpowder in the hole there inside the hollow shell, but you use this wooden plug to over the top of that, and in that wooden plug, you've got a slit in which you place a paper match. Paper match is just paper that will burn at a predictable rate. It's laced with a gunpowder, a mixture of gunpowder, sulfur, and stuff, so that it will burn at a predictable rate. Well, there's a problem with this. First off, if you fire a shell from a gun, the heavier pressure from that heavy powder charge will have a tendency, not always, but quite often, will blow that plug into the shell. When that happens, shell blows up in the barrel, and the artillerist has a bad day. Don't want to have a bad day. So that's why you got to use it from a howitzer that will gently loft that out there to the range. Unfortunately, there's a reduction in range because of that. We'll go into that in just a minute. The other problem with a shell on the Napoleonic battlefield, if you're an artillerist, you have to perform, firing a shell, you've got to perform a complex math problem while you're being shot at. You've got to first figure out what's the range to the enemy. What's the range to the target you're going to try to hit? Then compute the time of flight of your shell before it gets to that target. And then from there, you've got to go to your match paper and measure that and say, how many inches equal the 4 seconds or 3 seconds that I want the shell to fly before it explodes. You've got to do all this in your head and get it right, and then mount the fuse plug into the shell and then load it up. All of this choreography's got to happen while you're under fire. So the shell is not as flexible on the Napoleonic battlefield as we'll see it's later, because the technology needs to be refined. The grand tactics piece of this, on the Napoleonic field, the generals have realized now that more than just simply being big muskets, a massive artillery can do a significant amount of damage on that other end. So the artillery becomes more and more a battering force that they can use either in the offense or the defense. Of course, we mentioned Napoleon refining these tactics to a fine degree. They increased the ratio of cannons to 4 to 6 per 1,000 men. So greatly over what we saw at Guilford Courthouse. Oftentimes we'll hear the term artillery charge thrown around about Napoleonic tactics. I'm here to tell you it's oversold. It's oversold. It is important to understand, the Napoleonic charge and artillery charge, what it was there for, but it's also important to put it in context. Most historians will cite the Battle of Friedland, June 14th, 1807, as the first real Napoleonic charge. And just the background on this battle, Napoleon is fighting the Russians. He's got their backs to a river here, the river, I'll mispronounce it here, the river Ali. They've got their backs to the river, and he wants to finish them off. And his infantry has been fighting all day, and they're having to recover. They're a bit disorganized. The cavalry is off doing, by this time they've made their charges, and now they're off, doing the things that cavalry do after they've done their saber tinking. But Napoleon wants to finish this, and so he turns to his artillery chief, General Cernamont. My French is bad, guys. I spelled his name right. Trust me, I spelled his name right at least, but I may not be able to pronounce it. he turns to his artillery chief and says, what can you do? And he says, well, General, why don't I mass the artillery on the flanks of the Russians and try this artillery charge that I've been proposing to you before? Napoleon says, well, go do it then. So what Cernamont will do is he lines up his artillery, 30 guns on each flank. I've got them circled here in yellow on each flank of this Russian position, and he begins bombarding them at 800 yards. He keeps them under constant bombardment, keeps them under pressure. The Russians can't, they have trouble, at that range. They're not going to be able to get a respite as the French guns are dropping projectiles on them. He then begins to bound the batteries forward one at a time, closer in. So he moves them to 600 yards, 300 yards, 150, and finally at 60 yards, he starts using canister directly on the infantry line. So this is a rare case where canister is being used in an offensive manner, and he's keeping the Russian infantry and their artillery from doing, it's basically keeping them pinned. All the while, Napoleon's able to get his infantry, move them up, get them reorganized, and move them up without having to deal with the counter battery fires or the other Russian fires disrupting his infantry. And when they can get within 60 yards of the Russian line, they can go to cold steel and they can finish this job. This is the essence of an artillery charge, to be able to keep your enemy under a constant bombardment and close with them and force them to really pin them down so they can't maneuver. Was this used very often in the Napoleonic eras? Not as often as we might think. In fact, this becomes kind of I like to say, it's a much ballyhooed selection of the armchair general. In real life, these are very complicated maneuvers, and they tend to expose your artillery in ways that you don't want it to be exposed. So this is one of the great reasons I always say, well, the Napoleonic artillery charge, why didn't the Americans use them? Because they really didn't work on the Civil War battlefield. They might work on a good occasion, on a good day on the Napoleonic battlefield, but I wouldn't invest my artillery arm in that. One of the reasons why that Napoleonic artillery charge could be carried off was because of some of the tactical tactical problems that needed to be addressed by technology. The two ones I want to focus on here, I'm going to title this Unicorns and Shrapnel. All right, let's go with the one you probably don't know, unicorns. More properly, this would have been the Russian licorn, the Russian pronunciation of unicorn. It's probably the least understood and least appreciated today. But what you're looking at here, the evolution of the howitzer is really what this means. You see on the upper left, that is a French Bussier des Six Ponces Griebenball. Again, my French is terrible, but I spelled it right. Okay, give me points. You see how short and stubby this is. Again, go back to that shell. We don't want that shell to be in the barrel of the howitzer very long, because we're afraid that it might blow that fuse plug in and it might blow up on us. So we want to make it short. We also want to keep it, there's some other ballistic properties you want to go with, but because it's so short and because of those compromises in that design, that French howitzer can only range to about a third, maybe at best half of the range of the guns that it's paired with. So it can't really get the shell out there to really, you can't get it out to the good ranges that you do a gun. And so you can't take advantage of its fire effects on a lot of the battlefields. What the Russians do, very simple, they lengthen the barrel of the gun. They say, look, we'll accept the danger of the shell blowing up, but we're going to lengthen the barrel of the gun. With that, you get different ballistic properties. Now the shell spends more time in the barrel, gets more of the push from that propellant charge, and gets significantly better range. This Russian half pud, they had a different measuring system, but half pud unicorn, I want to be true to their designation. It could get out the range over half to 2/3 the range of the guns that it's assigned to work with. The Russians will go into battle in the later stages of the Napoleonic Wars. They'll have 4 to 6 guns in a battery, and then work with 2 to 4 of these unicorns in that same battery. So these howitzers, these heavy howitzers is maybe what I would call them, are now working to cover the dead zones that the guns can't reach with their their flat trajectories. The howitzers can maybe arch a shell and put it behind a terrain feature at times, but more importantly, can extend the range of that shell and get those fire effects that are so desirable on the battlefield. And of course, after the Russians do this, the French are on the receiving end of this. Everybody starts building these bigger howitzers. The other great advance here is with the projectiles. No doubt you've heard the name Henry Shrapnel. In 1784, he designed a system for loading a shell with lead bullets and a bursting charge. The ideal here is the original shell. It's more of an anti-fortification weapon. That's where it's derived from. And it doesn't have, it's more the concussive effect is what you receive. It doesn't have a good predictable scatter pattern when it explodes. It doesn't fragment in a predictable way. And so what shrapnel's doing is he places the submunitions inside the shell. That smaller bursting charge is just enough to break up the shell and scatter these projectiles and put that payload. Some have called it, well, hey, look, all you're doing is basically taking canister and having it deploy at a distance on the battlefield. That's one way to put it. I like to look at it this way. It's just giving you a shell that has a more effective scatter pattern. Whereas the shell was designed as an anti-fortification weapon, shrapnel is clearly designed as anti-personnel. I would note that they will, just like with the canister, they'll switch to cast iron balls inside of what they will eventually call from shrapnel. They'll call it case shot. And they'll use that because they don't deform whenever the bursting charge acts. So these two innovations, they're coming at the tail end. And oh, by the way, the British, it's invented in 1784, but the British don't adopt it until 1803. And then even then, the other European armies are very slow to adopt, to take on case shot. It was met with a little bit of skepticism, but once they started using it, everybody had to have it. These two innovations inspire tactical changes in the post-war. And as those tactical changes occur, changes in peacetime are a little bit slower than they are in wartime, but this now brings the armies to look for other technology to improve upon. And none more so than in France, where you have this gentleman here, Emperor Napoleon III. He turns to his ordnance officers and artillerists and say, I need a new gun. I need a new gun that can fire shot, shell, case, and canister all in one. And the ideal is I want one gun to replace all of my field artillery. So that's how he goes off designing this. And you see the designation up there, Canon Obusier de 12, model 1853. The nomenclature here is kind of important. The French are calling this canon, is their word for gun. Obusier is howitzer. So a gun howitzer is what they're officially calling it. The British will translate that literally. The French actually, you see them also use this and refer to this as a shell gun in reflection of that it's a gun that can fire shell. It's kind of a quaint term of its day, shell gun. But the essence here is Napoleon III is wanting to replace, I should say, yes, he's a I believe nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, namesake. He wants to, just like his namesake, he is an artillerist, a trained artillerist, and he puts a lot of emphasis in this, making his artillery the best in Europe. His intent to replace all his artillery doesn't play out. As they begin to use this weapon and begin to test it, they determine it's good enough for the divisional and corps artillery, but the artillery reserve, the French retain their heavy guns, their heavy 12-pounders, their heavy howitzers. They also go to the horse artillery, and they get their old 9-pounder field guns. They bore them out to 12-pounder bore, and they issue those to the horse artillery. And so it doesn't achieve the initial design goals, but it is a very effective weapon in its day. Some important parts here I'm going to emphasize here because I want you to hold on to it and think about it. Look at the exterior of this gun. If you look at it in the photograph and in the line drawing, this has got rings on it, adornments, the handles. From the outside, you would not think, the Americans look at it and say, well, that's not a Napoleon. No, this is a French Napoleon. It looks different on the outside. More importantly, the interior is a little bit different. Notice here what we call the first reinforce. The first reinforce is from the back of the gun all the way forward to just before the trunnions. This is the part of the gun that's got to withstand the heaviest pressure from the propellant charge. Notice that this is tapering. It tapers from the vent down to where the shot is seated. It's a taper. And the French design it that way. First off, is they want to reduce the amount of metal that's used to make the gun as light as possible. But their design characteristics, they're looking for different ranges or different performance for shot and shell, and they're adjusting reducing the reinforce to reflect a change in the way that they want to utilize the propellant charge. This is going to be very important when we talk about the American Napoleon and how it was designed. So, but let's go back to our side of the Atlantic here for a bit, because there's tactical innovations occurring on our side, believe it or not. If you don't know this gentleman here, Dennis Hart Mahan, you probably want to get to know him. He was the main professor at West Point in the pre-war period and antebellum period in American history. Taught most of our West Pointers and influenced them. Those that he didn't teach greatly influenced. He will also write several manuals that get in great circulation. One of those manuals, I could pick a treatise on field fortification and pull information about artillery, but we're talking about field artillery here. And so the manual we want to go to is one called Outpost, or more precisely, an elementary treatise on advanced guards, outpost, and detachment service of troops, and the manner for posting and handling them in the presence of the enemy, blah, 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 blah. It goes on for almost a paragraph. Guys, this is not a book you want to draw in charades. I mean, you would be up there for an hour trying to get that title across, but we just call it Outpost. In Outpost, in the preface, Mahan spells out why he's writing this manual. He says, quote, English military literature is quite barren on the systemic works on most branches of the military art, especially those known among the military writers on the continent as Le Petit Guerrier. Okay, my French is bad, the small war. Or, as Mahan continues, or the manner of conducting operations of small independent bodies of troops. Now, Mahan goes on in that preface to point out the Americans are almost always going to be using small bodies of troops. We're always going to be fighting small wars, either on the frontier where we can't, just small bodies of troops are the way they're deployed from their garrisons, or even on the eastern seaboard, even on the Atlantic coast. The shipping restrictions will prevent the Europeans from bringing very large armies over, and the Americans were already committed to a small standing army, so we'll never fight a very, very large war, at least against, if we're going to fight the Europeans. We know Civil War came and washed that away because we fought ourselves. But from Mahan's approach here for teaching Americans how to fight Europeans, he says, look, we're going to be fighting small wars, so let's plan to fight small wars. Well, in that context, what he will say is, well, what do we need the artillery to do? He will conform to the European thought as saying artillery is third in rank among the arms, but he goes on to say, and quote here, its duties are to support and cover the other arms, keep the enemy from approaching too near, hold him in check when he advances, and prevent him from debouching at particular points. So we don't use the word debouching enough nowadays. It's kind of like practicable, if you ask me. We should use it more, but let me translate this to the 21st century for us. He wants the artillery to take away options from the enemy commander. Think about your Clausewitz. What he said, the worst thing a commander can do on the battlefield is change his plan. What Mahan is saying, the artillery should make the enemy commander change his plan. When he changes his plan, he might make a mistake, and then the small American army can take advantage of that. This is all working into his theory of how the artillery should be used, more importantly, how the Americans can negate a larger European army. In this context, Mahan will write, for the defense, he'll say, quote, the principal part is usually assigned the artillery, and the position taken to the other arms will therefore be subordinate to those of this arm. The batteries must be distributed along the entire front of the position occupied and on those from which can be attained a good sweep over the avenues of approach to it. The guns being masked when ground favors from the enemy's view until proper moment arrives for their opening of fire. Those positions for batteries must be avoided from which the shot must pass over the other troops, the friendly troops, no friendly fires, who he's referring to here. And those should be sought from which fire can be maintained until the enemy has approached even within good musket range. So that's the defense. What does he say about the offense? Quote, in the onset of offensive movements, good positions should be selected for the heaviest pieces from which they can maintain strong fire on the enemy until the lighter pieces and columns of attack can be brought into action. These positions should be taken on the flanks of the ground occupied by the assailant. So on the flanks of the assaulting force, or on the center if more favorable to the end can be attained. The artillery takes position where it can silence the batteries of the assailed and then prepare the way for the advance of the other troops. So an important departure here from the European thought. The American artillery in the offense should first silence the enemy guns and then pave the way for the infantry. Mahan is going to place great value on mobility. If you're going to take advantage of an enemy mistake, you need to have guns that are highly maneuverable. If you need to be able to adjust to a rapidly evolving tactical situation, maneuverability, mobility is very important to the artillery in Mahan's view. And so this means the Americans have to look through all of the weapons they have and kind of take a departure from what the Europeans are using. So let me introduce here another gentleman that if you don't know, you probably want to get to know, Alfred Mordecai. He is a major in the U.S. Army. He's an ordnance officer, probably one of the best we have in the antebellum period. He's responsible for most of the model 1841 designs. In the 1850s, he is tasked with developing a weapon that will throw the projectiles of a 12-pounder field gun, but have the mobility of a 6-pounder field gun. All right. He takes the French Napoleon, yes, he does, as a baseline. He's inspired by it, but the product he produces is very much an American refinement. His emphasis in this design is on the ratio of the weight of shot to the weight of propellant charge, and then to the overall weight of the gun. In effect, he's going to wring out every ounce of range he can from a standard service charge within the lightest possible gun. You'll see some important differences here. And we've got a table we're going to come up. I'm going to put numbers to this. But remember I said the French had a tapering reinforce? Well, take a look at these Napoleons here. I've got pictures of the American Napoleons. This reinforced from the base of the gun, or out here on the breech end through the vent, all the way up for almost to the trunnions. That's a solid, it's a pure cylinder. It doesn't taper. It's a uniform thickness all the way through. Now Mordecai will take his prototype, and it survives today. Light 12-pounder light field gun #1. It's down at Petersburg. Don't let the dust confuse you there. It's in a diorama there, but it's well preserved. He'll take it to Fort McHenry. They'll test it there, and from that test, he says, quote, "The piece is a medium weight between the French guns and the lighter model adopted in Russia. Its strength and weight are believed to be quite sufficient to resist the effects of our service charge, and the facility for maneuvering appears from a preliminary trial to be very satisfactory. With 6 horses to a piece, little difference can be seen in the rapidity of movement between this and the 6-pounder. Even with 4 horses, the draught is not too heavy for short service in case of need." Of course, we know from our Civil War battlefields, these 12-pounder light field guns were pulled around with 4 horses with relative ease, with no problem. So the emphasis here, this is an American weapon designed to American requirements. It may have borrowed something from the French, but it's decidedly an American design. He will lengthen after the trials, they lengthen the gun by 3 inches, making it a little bit heavier, makes a few tweaks in the thickness of the metal over the, on that reinforced, and that produces this weapon you see in the lower lower right. As we know and love from our battlefields, we call it the Napoleon, but officially it is a model 1857 modified 12-pounder light field gun. My supposition has always been the branding of Napoleon here. It was in part because the Army, when it goes to Congress to get money in those lean pre-war eras, they're going to get asked the question, "Oh, you want new cannons? So who designed these cannons?" It's a whole lot better to say, "Oh, we got these from the French. Trust us, the French make good guns. They're good," as opposed to saying, "Yeah, there's some that our guys designed that are probably going to blow up again." Okay, so the Princeton incident was still on the fresh in the minds of congressmen. Now, Mordecai goes on further to do what Napoleon III could not do. He reports that all of the American field artillery should be replaced by this 12-pounder light field gun. Just replace them all. No need to have howitzers and 6-pounders. Just one standard 12-pounder light field gun will suffice. He makes one allowance, saying that all right, we may use the 6-pounders on the frontier because we're less apt to run into enemy artillery out there. And furthermore, they bring about a third more guns per ammunition or projectiles per ammunition chest than the Napoleon will. So, that was an allowance he offered up. 12-pounder mountain howitzer also, you could argue that was an allowance, but I would say it's more of a specialist role. And that was really it. He was going to replace all American artillery with this light 12-pounder field gun. You've gotten a chart. You should see it, an image that's in the in the chat. Please, by all means, open this up so you can see it and browse through those numbers. I just want to briefly here call out the highlighted lines. You see the column on the far left there, that's the French Napoleon, the Canon Ubusier de 12. On the far right side, you see our American Napoleon, the model 1857 light field gun. As you look down those two columns at the highlighted lines, first off, the French gun is longer than our gun by over a full caliber. So, what's that, 8 inches or so? It does have some, does mean that there's different ballistic properties. The next thing, I told you about the thickness of the vents, the thickness of the metal with that reinforced. Notice the French at the vent, it's 3.48 inches and it tapers to just over 3 inches. Look over at the American column, 3.19 inches uniform from the vent to the seat of the shot, which means it's designed to uniformly contain a powder charge, whereas the French, they're looking at a variable powder charge. Now that middle highlighted line, the weight of the gun proportional to the shot, 100 times the weight of the shot on both the French and the American Napoleon. So that's a design characteristic Mordecai brought forward. But now let's look down to the last two highlighted lines. The powder charge for shot for French is just over 3 pounds. For shell, it's reduced to 2.2 pounds. So the French sacrifice the range of the shell. They're willing to give up some range on the shell to maximize the range of the solid shot. The Americans went with a standard 2.5 pounds. So our solid shot doesn't range as far as the French solid shot, but our shell is almost as, given the variables here of the weight of shot and all the physics. I don't want to go into a physics class here, but a American shell, it's expected to fall about 300 yards short of where a shell would fall, or a solid shot would fall. So the Americans had longer range shell, optimizing the gun for that. Main point here I want to drive home is Mordecai, he may have borrowed from the French, but what he produced was decidedly American for American requirements. So while he's working on the guns, we've got some artillery theorists that had started advancing and refining Mahan's doctrine and putting it down in words. The four notable guys I want to emphasize here: William French, lower left here, West Point class of 1837, William Berry, West Point 1838, Henry Hunt, 1 year behind him, 1839, and then you've got John Gibbon, almost a decade later, West Point class of 1847. Now, all of these guys go on to prominent roles during the Civil War, if not great roles and being great leaders. I would argue that French's main contribution to the war effort was him co-writing the pre-war 1860s Field Artillery Tactics Manual, co-writing it with Berry and Hunt. That's really, I'll listen to arguments that, about French, but I'll tell you, I really think this was his greatest accomplishment, being a co-author. In that manual, it's coming out just on the eve of the Civil War. Most of it, about 2/3 of that manual is about maneuver and drill, which is important. You got to have the artillerists acting, all moving the same way on the battlefield. It's important to get that down. But they talk a bit about the tactics. More importantly, what I'll emphasize here is the ratio of cannon to infantry. In that manual, they propose 1 to 2 cannon per 1,000 infantry as an American standard for U.S. regulars. They're thinking the U.S. regulars, they know how to stand and fight, so we're going to reduce the ratio of cannon. However, for militia, who expect to be green troops, we need to up that to 3 to 4 cannon per 1,000. Still not up to the level that Napoleonic wars would see, but adjusted for the American way of fighting and the American tactics. Now, we'll often hear, John Gibbon, the manual he writes is really more so a introduction to, I call it a how to be an artillerist manual. And it's got great bits of information in there about the technology, the theory and practice of fire. It's good stuff, but just the departure here, what Gibbon will talk about there that the other gentlemen couldn't in their official tactics manual are the rifles. And he touches upon these, and he doesn't say the rifles are no good, but what he says is, well, just don't see them being a great innovation that's going to cause us to change our tactics. And I think he was spot on here. What Gibbon will say is that he looks at it and says, great, the rifle, the things that you think about rifles are it's increased range and increased accuracy. Well, let's think about accuracy first. So if I place a shell within 8 feet of you, are you going to walk the effects of that shell off within the next 24 hours? Probably not, if ever. So it's all relative here. Kind of the horseshoes and hand grenades argument comes into play. As long as I can get that shell in close proximity to the intended target, I don't need pinpoint accuracy. I just need to get it generally, close enough to achieve those, to spread those fire effects. So accuracy, it has its place if I've got a pinpoint target, but otherwise I'm firing at area targets, and that means the rifle may not be a great advantage here. The range factors, and I chose this photograph because this is a mid-war battle, Chickamauga. If you know the place, this is Chickamauga, Snodgrass Hill. What's the range between that 3-inch ordnance rifle and that tree line? About 800 yards. So they're not getting on the American battlefields. You can't really fold out and use that range to great effect in a lot of tactical situations. But rifles have their place. They have there's a good reason to have them there. But the smoothbore can be just as good at the battle ranges. More importantly, let's compare that Napoleon that we saw on the other slides to this 3-inch ordnance rifle. The Napoleon, it's projectile for projectile. The throw weight, in other words, the weight of the projectile it's putting out there is roughly twice that of the 3-inch ordnance rifle. So gun for gun, shot for shot, the Napoleon's putting more metal, more explosions, more fire effects, twice as much on the receiving end as the 3-inch ordnance rifle. It just doesn't have the range. So what the artillerists of the Civil War look to, and what Gibbon and others are espousing, is you got to approach this. I like to call it the golf bag approach. You don't go play around a golf with one club in your bag. You show up with all the clubs that you can stick in that bag. And so for the field artillerist on the Civil War battlefield, you want to have rifles and smoothbores. You want to use rifles where rifles need to be used, where you need accurate long-range fires. You want to have smoothbore where closer range, heavy fire effects fires are required. And this is it's going to kind of run the mix there, if you will, between rifles and smoothbores, the tactical selection there. Now, what Gibbon will write is he thinks, hey, that if the technology is going to change some things in the near future, and he's writing this in 1860, it's not going to be the rifle, it's going to be the fuse. And the fuses now are catching up. Remember, we talked about that wooden plug and the paper fuse, the match fuse. Well, this had been the technical innovations bring a better fuse to the gunners. More importantly, better shells. You see right off the top, if you're not familiar with this, is a Borman fuse. Notice here on the left-hand side, you've got the numbers on this fuse. You've got a punch here where the number 2 used to be. Notice it's even graduated in the quarter of a second. So a gunner, he could actually select down to the quarter of a second. So what he would do is a gunner, during the Civil War, if he's using Borman fuse, would go to his ammunition chest. He would consult the table that said, what's the range? And that's really all he can do is know the range. Say it's 1,000 yards. He's firing a Napoleon. I believe that comes to about 4¼ seconds or so. Don't quote me on that. I'm thinking off the fly here, but about 4 seconds. And so he would take the fuse wrench and punch the hole in this CAD diagram where you see a 4. That exposes this red matrix that burns at a predictable rate. It's very important that the Ordnance Department get that rate right. Just ask the Confederates at Gettysburg what happens when that doesn't happen or that doesn't occur. But it's going to burn at a predictable rate. It's going to take 4 seconds for it to burn down this red before it gets to the yellow. When it gets to the yellow, that's the primer. That goes off and sets the shell off. So now all the gunner has to do is know the range, consult the table, punch a hole in the fuse, and shoot. More importantly, perhaps to the safety aspects of it, this Borman fuse screws into the shell, and it's a metal cap. So it's less apt to get blown into the shell and cause a bad day for the artillerist. So all around, this is a better fuse. It makes for a better shell, and it gives them better fire effects on the distant end. Rifle projectiles, you see an example of a percussion fuse there, real briefly, that once it's fired, that slider that you see here in the middle, it is jarred loose from a restraining system, be it glue or just simply a paper mache fix. It breaks loose, and when it hits a solid object, that slider slams against a percussion cap. That then in turn ignites the powder charge that blows up the shell. The Federals in particular get really advanced with this and have combination fuses where you've got both the percussion effect and the time effect, like as in the Borman or other mechanical timing effects. So now the gunner just needs to set the fuse for, say, 4 seconds. And so when it goes down range, it will explode in 4 seconds, or when it hits a dense target, be it the ground or a tree or something, whichever comes first. Combination fuses really made rifle projectiles very effective. Now, for the first time in the gunpowder era, a gunner only needs to know where the target is. He doesn't actually have to see it. It's helpful to see the target so you know if you need to adjust on it, but they're beginning to get to the point where they can just, as long as they know where it's at, they can put fire effects on that target. And now that means that the commanders could direct for fire effects, direct the artillery to engage things on a greater depth of the battlefield than ever before. So let's get down to how these tactics were used on the Civil War battlefield. First major battle where field artillery is used, Manassas. I like to call it how not to use artillery. Right off the bat, let's look at the proportion of guns to infantry going into the battle. McDowell from the Federal side shows up. He's got 1.3 guns per 1,000 men. So barely in the range that the pre-war manuals said for regular troops. If you actually look at the troops engaged, it's even worse, 1.25 guns per 1,000 men. And on top of that, he brought mostly rifles to this engagement. It gets a little bit better on the Confederate side, is they start out with overall 1.25 guns per 1,000 men. But then if you narrow down to just the troops that were engaged, 1.5 guns per 1,000 men. But neither side is getting artillery in the ratio that you would expect based on the tactics. We especially dealing with green troops, which everybody was green on this battlefield. And before we leave here, no, McDowell didn't order an artillery charge up Henry Hill. I would argue this was a complex maneuver based on a very poor understanding of the tactical situation. And McDowell is trying to achieve an ends here, and he makes a mistake. And have Harry Smeltzer on here sometime, and he'll talk to you about what McDowell's plan really was, or what he thinks it really was. He's got a good line on that. I just tend to think that McDowell is trying to continue a turning movement. He wants to anchor his turning movement to force Beauregard out of a position. He just picks the wrong place to anchor his turning movement. On the Confederate side, you can say that Jackson kept up a good used artillery very well if he was a Napoleonic marshal. He masses the guns, but he uses them as a battering tool, and not the way that Mahan would have preferred him use those guns. Now, for the artillerists in blue, this is a stinging disaster at Manassas. They lose a lot of guns. The artillery is in bad light. And this is a lesson they're going to learn early on and take to heart. For the Confederates, the victory here kind of leads to a little bit of complacency, and we'll see they're a little bit slower to catch up. So let's talk about that reaction from Manassas. This gentleman here, you met him before, William Berry. He was the chief of artillery on the field at Manassas, didn't get listened to. Now he's the chief of artillery of the brand new Army of the Potomac, and he goes into his new boss, General George McClellan, in August of 1861 and lays down a memo and says, this is how I want to reform the artillery. And give McClellan credit. He said, he didn't argue with Berry. He said, go out and do it. You must know what you're doing. So what does he say to do? First and foremost, we got to get the ratio of guns up to 3 per 1,000 men. 3 per 1,000 men. The guns he wants to get, he wants to have 1/3 of the Army of the Potomac is rifles, 2/3 of the artillery is smoothbore. But he puts a caveat here. He says, this is for green troops. We want to have 1/3 rifle, 2/3 smoothbore, because we need more smoothbore direct support of the infantry. When the infantry have been seasoned and they know what they're doing, we'll reduce that ratio down to half and half. He wants to standardize all the weapons in the Army. Parrots, ordnance rifles, and Napoleons. These are the three that he trusts. These are the three that he thinks he can get in good numbers. Very good idea. Very, looks down the road. And he knows what he's talking about here, because indeed these are the big three on the for American Civil War artillery: Parrots, ordnance rifles, and Napoleons. If you're Confederates, you got the fake Parrots, you got the knockoff ordnance rifles, and you got the Confederate Napoleons. Both sides will standardize kind of on the same big three, I guess you could say. Barry also wants 6-gun batteries, no 4-gun batteries, no 8-gun batteries, 6-gun batteries with uniform equipment, no mixing and matching rifles and smoothbores. He's willing to accept some 6-pounders and 12-pound field howitzers, but he wants those in uniform batteries until he can get those standardized Parrots, ordnance, and Napoleons. He wants 4 batteries per infantry division initially. Get them down supporting the infantry divisions, not down to the brigades, but at the division level. But the caveat here is he's going to pull those back. Once the infantry gets seasoned, pull those back to the corps level or back to the army level and concentrate the artillery there. So that's just a temporary assignment until the infantry get up to speed. He then asked for an artillery reserve of 100 guns minimum. Keep in mind, inside this artillery reserve includes the horse artillery. In Barry's mind, Hunt's mind, and every Civil War artillerist's mind, at least in the Army of the Potomac, the horse artillery belonged to the reserve artillery. Horse artillery is not, as some might say, just assigned to the cavalry. Yes, the role, the purpose of having the horse artillery was to provide the commander with a rapid, highly mobile force that he could move rapidly around the battlefield to influence the battlefield situation. It just kind of goes hand in hand, though. The force that he's going to send to do those missions is going to be the cavalry. So yeah, there's a often a habitual relationship between the horse artillery and the cavalry, but organizationally it belongs to the reserve artillery. He also asked for a siege train of 50 guns. Doesn't get much use of it in 62, maybe outside of Yorktown and such like that, but it really comes into the fore in 1864 at Petersburg. Brett, you're out there. Shout out to you there. I see you, buddy. He also orders the stockage of 400 rounds per gun. He doesn't want his artillery ever running out of ammunition on a battlefield. Make sure that they've got plenty more coming up in the trains to resupply that 400 rounds per guns. The last 2 bullets are very important. He's going to train all the batteries with his field manual, the manual of 1860. That is the standard. None of this, hey, French translation of somebody else's manual or some knockoff that some publisher put out in Massachusetts. No, these are going to be everybody's going to get trained by the standard U.S. Army field manual for artillery, and the chief of artillery, Barry, will inspect those batteries. If they're not trained well, if they're not equipped well, if their horses aren't good, if their caissons and anything is lacking, he sends them to the rear. They will go to Camp Barry for retraining, re-equipping, and they'll stay there until they pass muster and can go to the front. And they'll keep this up throughout the war. Now, these standards, yes, it's the Army of the Potomac that these are being applied to in 1861, but I could go back and look at all of the major field armies, even in the West. Gradually, these principles are applied to all the federal field artillery during the war. On the Confederate side, we see some variations of this, especially with the standardization of the field guns and the batteries, that the Confederates often had to work with what they had, but they always prefer to have standardized batteries with using those big 3 where possible. So how does this work out? Well, when the Army of the Potomac's artillery is next in major battles, they do very well. None so better than on July 1st, 1862, Malvern Hill. Hunt will execute a defense, according to Mahan, almost to a T. And it's Hunt who's responsible for the placing the guns because he's in charge of the reserve artillery. So the reserve, under Mahan's doctrine, the reserve artillery is placed first. That's your heavy guns. Then you place the corps artillery, and then you place the infantry, which is exactly the way Hunt worked this out. Hunt ensured his gunners had clear fields of fire. Where terrain blocked or masked their fires, he had other guns putting fires on that dead space so that the Confederates were never out from underneath his guns. The advancing Confederates are going to be under fire from their line of departure all the way forward to the Federal guns. I mean, you look in the lower right here, I've got a photograph looking down one of the barrels of those Napoleons. The Confederates start way back here in that light brown field, and they're under fire the whole way. And note here in the painting, you've got the Federal artillery battery, or a section here more aptly is deployed here. You got the infantry supporting them. You got skirmishers in front of the infantry, but notice there's nothing in front of the cannons. They've got a clear fire. They're not having to fire over friendly troops to get to the enemy. And the Confederates have advanced here within musket range, and Hunt's guns are still blazing away at them. Not seen here in any of these photographs. I can't depict this, but we know from the reports, Berry is getting ammunition up to him in a timely manner. The Federal gunners had plenty of ammunition to fight this battle, and they could keep fighting the next day if they needed to. The ratio of guns here is kind of important. The Federals in this battle have a ratio of 3 guns per 1,000 men, roughly speaking, give or take a few fractions there. Confederate ratio, 1.25 guns per 1,000 men. So the Confederates have a disadvantage. They have fewer cannon, and they've got the ground that they're deploying them on is not suitable for covering an offensive. And so the Confederates are on the short end of this stick, and they're going to learn from this, because the next time the Confederates go into action, they've thought through how to use artillery in the offensive. So let's move forward 10 months, switch to the other side of the field, the Confederate side. May 3rd, 1863. A lot of you probably know the score here. The night before, Jackson's mortally wounded. Jeb Stuart's put in charge of his infantry corps temporarily. So Lee is down a good commander, and he's got a temporary team put together. Lee is outnumbered on the field, but Lee wants to finish Hooker off. He wants to nip this in the bud. So he's got to take on this salient that Hooker has around the Chancellorsville crossroads here. So what he's going to order Stuart to make continue Jackson's assault from the previous day. In order to support that, if you can follow my cursor, maybe I need to, well, I can't get the highlighter here, but if you can follow my cursor, Hazel Grove down here, you've got a picture of that in the upper right. Lee wants to take this position, use it as a platform to bombard the Federal lines. So he intends actually to make a dawn assault to take this, but Hooker obliges and just withdraws, gives him Hazel Grove. And immediately Lee will put 30 guns massed under Colonel Porter Alexander, and they begin firing on the Federal cannons at Fairview, off in the distance in my photo, but on the map, you see it just behind Sickles' line. Now, the initial Confederate infantry waves will close, but kind of falter here because they're getting good fire effects. The Confederates are able to hit the Federal lines with good effect, but they're not able to silence all those Federal guns. And so then 20 guns are placed on the Plank Road to supplement Alexander's bombardment, and together 50 guns total now silence the Federal guns. Very rare for the Confederates to silence massed the Federal guns in an open field engagement like it, but they achieved that on this day at Chancellorsville. And with that, they're able to pave the way for the infantry to assault. By 10 a.m., the infantry is in position at Fairview, and with that, Hooker withdraws from the crossroads. And we know this sets up a major defeat for Hooker and the Gettysburg campaign that will follow. The ratios here, inside of Jackson's corps, just looking at Jackson's corps, it's 3 guns per 1,000 men engaged. If you look overall, Lee's army, he's up to 4 guns per 1,000 men engaged. On the Federal side, they have 4 guns per 1,000 men, but they're not well distributed for the defense here. It's just a way to, simple fact of it, they didn't distribute them well. And we'll see this 4 guns per 1,000 men ratio continued through Gettysburg and into the fall, that the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia keep that ratio of guns to infantry. As the war progressed, we see some tactical evolutions that are, I would argue, these are less so tactical advances that are being made, but more so adaptations of the technology to meet the tactical problems that the gunners are facing. First and foremost, practice of fire with the familiarity with these new fuses, Bormans, those combination fuses, percussion fuses, that the artillerist now can accurately place a shell or case at specific places on the battlefield for fire effects. If they could see it, they could hit it. In some cases, they just simply needed to know where it's at. You see in the upper left there an example. This is, I believe, it was on the Confederate side of Fredericksburg. A Federal case shot just demolished this limber, or this caisson that was coming up, killed the horses, upended all the limber and knocked things around. And this is what the artillerists could do on the battlefield. You got a target, I can hit it. with the increased accuracy, not just aiming, but this timing of the fuses, this puts the infantry at a disadvantage. It's no small coincidence that starting in mid-1863, the infantry start taking a interest in digging in and entrenching, because the artillery now is far too accurate and can put those fire effects over their heads far too often. So you see those fortifications. By 1864, you see things like this showing up on the battlefield. That's from Atlanta. Federals have occupied a Confederate fortification there. But with the fortifications, you see this is kind of a action reaction thing. Now you start seeing mortars reintroduced, to be more exact, reintroduced to the field artillery, because now the artillerists need to fire something that gets over those fortifications to deliver that fire effect. We see the mortars arriving on the field artillery used on the field battles at Spotsylvania and throughout the overland campaign. And of course, by the time they get to Petersburg, there's mortars all up and down the line. Now I'm talking about cohorn mortars, not the big 8-inch and 10-inch like you see behind in my photo there. These little smaller cohorn mortars were being used in direct support of the infantry line. The ratio of artillery also begins to decrease. Remember, Berry said 3 guns per 1,000 men, and they increased it to 4 per 1,000 men by the Battle of Gettysburg. Well, when this same William Berry is advising William Tecumseh Sherman, I'll pause there, I'm hearing some boos and hisses. William Tecumseh Sherman, prior to the Atlanta campaign, Berry is his artillery chief, and when Sherman says, "How many cannons should I take?" Berry said, "We only need 2 guns per 1,000 men. That's all we need." He'll double down on that when they leave Atlanta going to Savannah on the march to the sea, and he says, "No, we really only need 1 gun per 1,000 men. We don't need as much artillery, boss, because our artillery works better. We don't need it for direct support of the infantry anymore. We can use the artillery to do artillery things specifically that you want to achieve." And so Hunt will do similar reductions in the Army of the Potomac. With the nature of the siege at Petersburg, he can never really achieve that reduction down because sieges require a lot more artillery. So wrapping up here, I know I'm kind of pressing on time here. Wrapping up here, what I would put to you is the American field artillery tactics of the Civil War. These are a result of a different spin on the tactical problems of the day. The Americans enter the war planning to fight a small war where artillery would be employed at lower ratios than their European counterparts would plan to use. The Americans sought to get the biggest bang for their buck in terms of weight and mobility of their guns. Within the framework of this pre-war doctrine, the American artillerists begin to shape the tactical battlefield as never before. They're adapting the technology to suit the tactics that they have been taught to use. In 1861, 1862, a commander could go on the field and maybe ignore his chief of artillery and might be able to wrestle a victory out of it just using his infantry and the coal steel and the cavalry. But in 1865, a commander who ignored his artillery chief did so at his own peril and often to great injury to his force. I thank you, and I will stand by here for your questions.
We are going to get to those questions in just a moment. Thanks for everyone's attention. That was fascinating. And there are a ton of questions already in the chat, and some of them are mine. So, but before we move on to the questions, we're going to go back to our normal routine, which is to, first of all, thank you for doing the presentation, and also to let folks know that you can still enter questions in the chat box if you haven't already done that. And reminder, if you'd like to ask your question live, you can raise your hand or pop me a message in the chat box, and we'll get your questions live. But before we get to those questions, Tina will tell us about the benefits of membership at Civil War Talk.
Well, over at the Civil War Talk community, we have hundreds of very interesting threads going on. Joining Civil War Talk is always free. If you want to go to a premium membership, it's only $12 a year, and you can get rid of the pesky Google ads. And right now, tonight, we have 2 threads really that are going, are McClellan's autobiography with over 2,000 views, and Custer and the Bighorn. And the big discussion there is about the Springfield trapdoor single shot versus Spencers and repeaters. if you'd like to come over to Civil War Talk. We would love to have you join as a member. And I want to give a shout out to Jim Boscheman, who is on tonight, and he just joined Civil War Talk today. And I went to school with him from kindergarten through 12th grade. So hi, Jim. And that's it, Laura. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Tina. And welcome aboard, Jim. I already welcomed him in a private message because I saw him here and I said, is this your first time to be on one of these? And he said, yes, it is. And I said, well, welcome aboard. So good to have new folks join us. Thanks for telling us all about Civil War Talk. Mr. Swain, if you are ready to get to those questions, we will get going.
Sure. Fire away.
All right, we will get going with those, and I'm gonna make sure that you are spotlighted so that you show up on the screen, and we will get going with those questions. Let's see. There you are. Let's see. I am going to start in the chat, and then I've got 4 or 5 folks that are going to ask their questions live, and I've got them kind of queued up for you, ready to go. So the first question is, can you speak to acoustic shadows?
I'd say I study artillery. I'm not so much a physicist, or I don't want to get trapped into that one because I'll get way out of my area of expertise. But I will say that my service in the Army, I ran into this quite often where especially on a gunnery range, we would have gunnery going on, and just over a fold in the terrain, or just a very short distance away. I mean, all sorts of noises going on the gunnery range, but the guys are sleeping soundly off in a draw off to the side, and it's the acoustic waves and the sound not tucking down in the terrain and such like that. Again, it's physics. There's a reason behind it. There's a book back here on the shelf behind me that I probably should pull out and start reading quotes from it on you. But suffice to say, I'm not an expert on the physics of that. I just know it happens.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And I'm going to ask one from way down in the chat, just because it was a good general question. Mr. DeMar asked, how were the artillerymen selected and recruited, and was it a special assignment, or how did they wind up in an artillery unit?
Very good question. Early in the war, what you typically would see, the recruitment pattern, if you will, or the mustering pattern, you would have a group of soldiers that they'd already formed a battery. It was already a militia battery or some other. In some cases, especially when you're talking about in my ancestors in Missouri, where they were involved with these Turner regiments, so that it was more of a club format. And even if they didn't have a gun, they would train on how to work the pieces and such like that. And so those were generally selected in scenarios where are you a good person? Do I know you? Are you somebody that I'm friends with, or maybe a son of a friend or something? And it's those things, and we see the similar patterns in the infantry and the cavalry too. But the artillery tended to be more localized or more personalized, because you're only talking maybe a few dozen men here to getting together to form those batteries. So it's really a lot more personalized. Later, as the war goes on, some volunteers will see, well, the artillery is a better place to be than the infantry. Because so I may be in an infantry regiment and I hear a call, hey, they're taking volunteers to go help out with this artillery battery that supports us, because they're short men. They've had sicknesses, or they got a lot wounded in the last battle or such, or killed. And so you'll see those transfers like that, where people, hey, it's better to be in the artillery because A, they ride, and B, they tend to be a little bit further back on the battlefield. Not always, but tend to be a little bit further back. The other enticement, if you will, with artillery is if you get into the heavy artillery. Early in the war, you're signing up for duty in some fort someplace, and it might be fatigue duty a lot. You're digging a lot of ditches. You're doing a lot of marching and polishing a brass, but hey, that's good duty. Yeah, it's good duty, right? You're not up on the front lines living on hardtack and salt pork and having the other infantry pop shots at you. As we know, in 1864, that kind of gets flipped around, and now the heavy artillery now are just another infantry force that they're moving out there on the battlefield. So yeah, there are some patterns there to it, and there's early war, late war. I would say that was there any selection criteria? I've never seen any that, do we need a big artillerist or a fat artillerist or a short artillerist? No. Hey, you want to join up with the artillery? Join the artillery.
I guess you just had to be tall enough to hold the rammer and the sponge, right?
Oh, yes.
So no children. Let's see. We are going to go to Mr. Smith, and he is going to ask his question live, and he is all set and ready for you. So there you go, Mr. Smith. If you can unmute, that'd be great.
Hey, can y'all hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, my question, sir, first of all, I enjoy it very much. My great-grandfather was from the Dawsonville or Dawson County area, and he joined the Chesapeake Light Artillery Group. And I did find one book about him, and later on he was captured at Middletown, Virginia, toward the end of the war, and was sent up to Elmira, New York, where they had just put a new prison camp together earlier in the summer. And fortunately, he was able to survive that camp. But do you know much about that Chesapeake Light Artillery? Does that ring a bell at all? There was a guy named William Beaumont that was his captain.
Not off the top of my head. I know of them, but I can't, it's one of those batteries that, I can't off the top of my head, figure out, okay, it was in this battle, and where they played. So not off the top of my head, but, it's something you could probably, shoot me an email or something. I can probably, give you a good synopsis of their service time and maybe some color behind that if I've found anything in my files with stories I've collected.
Later on, maybe you'll give us your email address. Another thing that I would like, Tina, later on, I had served over right at the end of the Korean War in an evacuation hospital and running the clinical lab. And we were able to save a lot of boys, but still I had to fill a lot of body bags as a young lieutenant. And I know that we were able to do better in Afghanistan and Iraq, and even better in Korea than they did in World War II. But that's one thing I'd like somebody to talk about later on, is the evolution of how good medical care has improved. I know we touched on it back a few months ago, but that's dear to me because of my service. Okay.
Okay, we'll definitely line up some medical programs for you and get those on the schedule. We are actually booking for March and April at this point. So I don't think we have a medical program set for before that, but we will see what we can do for you. Okay. All right.
One other thing, I sent my money in, I think, the Civil War TARP, but I never heard back from y'all. Could you check and see if y'all got that? I think I used a credit card, Visa credit card.
Yes, sir. I'll be glad to. Thank you. All
All
right.
right, well,
Let's
thank you.
see. Up next, Duncan has a question for us. And
Yes.
let me put you to the screen and you will be all set. There you go.
All right. I'd just like to start out by saying to Mr. Swain that I've been a longtime fan of his blog, and that it was one of the things that inspired me to get into artillery reenacting in Civil War, or reenacting. But so I was wondering about the discussion of the sort of ratios of guns to men, and specifically about how the battery size would affect the size of sections. So I noted that, like, it seems that for 1,000 men, which is roughly a regiment, they wanted 3 guns for it, 3 to 4 guns, but they wanted batteries of 6 guns. And I've always known that sections are 2 guns.
Yes.
So it does seem like that might cause a fundamental issue there. Like, what were they, hang on, I gotta look at my notes here. I believe it was Hunt we were talking about,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Yeah, was
Barry,
he thinking?
Barry.
Barry.
Yes.
Was Barry thinking that he was going to increase the size of sections to be 3 artillery pieces?
what he was looking at there is just in the aggregate. What he was saying is, hey, you may have a brigade of 3 regiments, 4 regiments. He didn't care, did not care whatsoever. He left that to the infantry. You let them figure out how they want to disperse it. What he was saying is, all right, if McClellan goes on the field and he's got 10,000 infantry deployed out in a line, that he is going to respond back, well, boss, it's 10,000 infantry. I got to do that math in my head. 3 times 10. So I'm going to put 30 guns with that force. And that may be, and he would obviously, he wouldn't say, let's cut a battery in half or worry about that. He would assign, then you would probably end up, I'm thinking, I'm trying to put my Barry or Hunt hat on here and say, all right, I'm going to send 8 batteries with that force. So that's actually going to be 32 guns. I'm going to give him a little bit extra because I don't want to split a battery up. Right. And then he's going to assume that infantry commander will listen to, he's going to have an artillery chief of that force of artillery sent. And he expects that infantry commander to listen to the artillery chief and say, boss, we're going to put guns here, here, and here. Because if you don't listen to me, then I'm going to get Barry to come down here and bark at you. Very famously, we know that played out almost, that's a good example because that's kind of what plays out between Sickles and Hunt at Gettysburg on day 2 is, Hunt saying, this is where I'm going to put the guns. Well, no, you won't because they're my guns. Well, let me bring my good friend George Meade down here and he'll tell you where I'm going to put my guns. And those kind of, that was the philosophy Hunt and Barry had about use of artillery is the commander should tell the artillerist what he wants to achieve, let the artillerist place the guns. Flip this over and go to the, and so that ratio now is more so a reflection of if I've got a smaller force of infantry, I'll have a captain as the chief of that artillery and maybe 2 batteries, maybe 3 batteries. And so it's not so much I'm going to split sections up and assign them and have them directly supporting that infantry, but that aggregate force should have an appropriate ratio of artillery under an artillery chief to support it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for that question. That was great. And thanks for the answer too.
Yep.
Excellent question.
Keep reenacting though. Keep reenacting.
Tina has a question for you that she wants to ask live.
Excuse me. With the concussive effect, I've read many times where like either a row of men or all the horses of another artillery thing will just drop dead. Did the makers of the shells ever plan out the concussive effect of shells? Like, did they have larger shells with, and I might have this backwards because I'm totally ignorant on artillery. Did they have shorter range shells with more concussive effects versus longer range shells with less concussive effects? And can you talk about that whole concussive effect thing where it will wipe out a battery?
I've never seen that they tried to, mix the different types of shells to, change the powder loading for any type of effect like that. What they did do is experiment around with the shell and maybe build segmentations so that the shell would crack or the scatter in a more predictable way. The again, the concussive effect, this is re-entered our military thought. It was good that the gentleman earlier mentioned the medical care and the advances. When I did my stint over in Iraq and Afghanistan, is one of the big, I wasn't on the front lines, but a lot of the talk was about, again, how these IEDs are really, really causing injuries to these soldiers. It wasn't that they were cut or bleeding or anything, but it just rattled their brains around, the concussive effect. And we'd kind of forgotten about this, in my opinion. We'd kind of forgotten about this in modern warfare. We knew artillery, exploding shells, it has this big effect, but because the artillery of Vietnam or Korean War, really World War II on, was so lethal over the battlefield that if a direct hit was made, you didn't see a lot of wounded. You saw a lot of dead. In Iraq, we started seeing a lot of more wounded, and they were not bleeding wounded, but they were concussed. You wear that, you got the helmet on, you got all this stuff, and it rattles you around. I got a chance, a few chances. It's kind of a morbid thing to say, but meeting some people who just had gotten hit by an IED, and it's more than you think. Well, okay, their bell was rung, like they were out on the football field and they got hit in a tackle, and so they're a little dazed. Oh no. It is very, very disruptive, and I don't take that lightly. Those effects. It's a very real injury, even though you don't see the blood, you don't see the direct effects. The person could stand there and you say, well, they're uninjured, but they're not of the right senses and such because of that concussive effect.
So it's traumatic brain injury.
Yes.
Is what it is, and to the nervous system. Thank you. I've learned so much tonight. A lot of it was over my head, but you really made I didn't understand about the ratio between smoothbore and rifled to and how that interplayed with your tactics. So thank you for making that clear for me.
Thank you. You're welcome.
All right, Mr. Gates has a question for you.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Appreciated your presentation.
No
and
thank you.
good job. You know your stuff. Always a plus. You did a good job answering. I had two questions, but you did a good job answering that first one regarding tactical changes with the use of the artillery going into the overland campaign and afterwards. I thought you did a good job with that. I had a question. You sort of got into some of the technical things about the use of fuses and so on. But I wonder if you'd explain how artillery officers and gunners were able to calculate the range based on a little trial and error with observations of distance and firing time. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, and I wish I'd known you were going to ask that question, because I've got a wonderful training aid. I actually have a reproduction Civil War rangefinder that I found in a thrift store someplace. It's branded with some modern logos on it, but it's an approximation of what they would use, and it really boils down to, if you know given the average height of a human, you can very quickly, if you've got a graduated scale, you can adjust a slider and set that and measure, and basically set that onto the height of that person, and look at your graduated scale and say, okay, the ratio now comes out that person's 5'10", then that means he's at 800 yards. That's one way they would do it. There are several other mechanisms. I mean, that's the one I know from some of the writings that the topographical engineers, in fact, they were the ones who espoused that method of estimating range at a glance. When I was a young officer, a lieutenant in the Army, we were taught range finding, and we were given all sorts of clues and tricks, and basically a lot of it went back to, again, measuring. Oh, there's a man standing out there. Let me put my finger up here and try to gather and figure out what it is. Other things we would learn is hold out your hand. God gave you an exact measuring tool to tell you what 5 degrees of elevation is. You hold out your hand from your thumb to your, hold out your hand like this, from your thumb to your pinky finger is roughly 5 degrees. And so if you know that, you can begin to estimate, well, what's the degrees of elevation? And if you can get the elevation, you can begin to put that into, do a rudimentary calculation in your head to begin to figure out range, even at a place where you don't have a enemy soldier giving you that reference point of standing up and saying, hi, I'm here, I'm 6 feet tall. There are all sorts of tricks in that they would use. Perhaps though the one that I'm most fond of telling about is from the Battle of Brandy Station. There's a phase in that battle where if you go to Brandy Station Day, we have a knoll we call Buford's Knoll. It's where John Buford's cavalry after they first got into action, they went to that knoll. Well, the Confederates had been there. They'd been there in the Battle of Rappahannock Station in '62, but they had been there most recently. And so the Confederates knew that ground. When the Confederates withdrew to safety, they put 2 cannon on the other side of a ridge opposite of that knoll. Well, when they got to the opposite side of that ridge, they knew the distance from where they were then to where they had been just a few moments before. They knew that distance because they had just traveled it. They could, count how many minutes did I travel at a known rate of speed? I know the range. And so they knew exactly what timing they needed to put on their fuse. And so that the 2 Confederate guns are engaging 3 Federal batteries. I got to get this right because Bud Hall's probably out there listening, and he'll quiz me on this tomorrow. 3 Federal batteries deploy in that area, and they're kind of massed up there. Well, the Confederates know exactly the range to that. They don't even have to see the Federal batteries. They can just put a shell, time to explode. In 4 seconds, it explodes over that battery, and it's destroying their horses. It's killing their horses. Elder's battery there at Brandy Station, they take only a few personnel wounded, but the battery's out of action because they lose most of their horses. They're barely able to get their guns and their caissons off the field. And that goes back to they know the range. They don't have to do any computations. They were just there, and so they just had to calculate, do a quick calculation and fire the shells.
The only thing I was going to add to it, in addition to what you said, was that some artillery officers would use stopwatch to time their fire.
True too.
And watch through the field glasses as to where their target was hitting, and do the same with the enemy battery, seeing the white puff of smoke and where it would land. And once they knew how much time it took, then they would do the math backwards, just like you talked about. To set the fuse.
Indeed, there's a range finding. It's, in my opinion, the modern Army, it's a lost art because those guys are running around with GPSs, and it's real easy. And I just know in the 90s they drilled it into our heads to be able to look across the field and instinctively be able to calculate the range. And once you get that down pat, I mean, to this day, I can go out and say, look at that's a quarter mile. I know it just looking at it and go from there. And it's something you pick up, and it's a perishable skill, but it's something that you can, it's got some practicality beyond the battlefield. I'll say that.
Thank you.
Certainly fascinating. What a fascinating question. Thank you so much, Mr. Gates. I'm going to read a few of these questions from the chat for you, and then we will we'll go back to, we got a couple more live questions. So tell us about the books that you recommend most for research on artillery, and then what's your favorite cannon?
Okay. Books. If you're just studying the types of artillery, design of artillery, types of artillery, there is an old classic out there by a gentleman by the name of Warren Ripley. He was I get a double dip here. Warren Ripley was a Charleston historian, so wrote a lot about the Charleston theater, and he wrote a lot about artillery. And but Warren Ripley's Civil War artillery, I can't speak to that, even though it's dated, even though it's 60s. I think the last reprint on it was early 80s or so. But it's a classic. You've got the field artillery. I've got it here handy. Should be handy. Field artillery of the Civil War. Olmsted and Daniel. I think it's Daniels. Yep. That's a good book. It's gone through 2 revisions. A lot of good information in that if you're studying the guns themselves. Of course, then there's Big Guns, which is out of print, hard to find. I don't think you can find that even on eBay for anything less than $100. I mean, it's a very good reference, and people like me who get a hold of it, we want to hold on to it. It'll probably be mentioned in my will, matter of fact. But if you're wanting to look on the tactics, we start getting into, and I hate to say it, but we get on thin ice because there's a lot of good writers, Civil War writers, historians who have explored tactics, but they seem to get stuck in the infantry mode, and they dwell there a little bit too much. Patty Griffith, in his Civil War tactics book, I don't think he gave the artillery a fair treatment, but I think he gave it a very deep treatment. I'll just put it that way. There's some faults I would find with his discussion of tactics. I think he looked at it through a European lens, and said, well, these Americans, had some faults here with their artillery, and didn't take into account the differences that we had. Patty Griffin. There's been a few others. I'm not going to throw them out here now because, again, I've got some misgivings about how artillery has been handled by historians exploring tactics, because I don't think that the right book has come along with the right context in mind.
Okay, thanks. And your favorite cannon?
My favorite cannon.
And why?
You're talking about a single cannon. There
Yes,
is
pick a model or
Yeah.
a model. It could be either one. Yeah.
I would still go with the 10-inch Rodman, because if you're gonna have a cannon, get a big one. Get a big one.
Okay, that I agree.
And by the way, that 10-inch Rodman, they were produced in the Civil War, and we used them in the Spanish-American War. No kidding. We still have them
Wow.
in use. That's
What
a
is
cannon.
that at Fort Monroe? There's a cannon there called the Lincoln gun. What is that? It's very large.
Yes, that's a 15-inch Rodman, the big boy. And that was the prototype, the first one they produced. So there's some technical nuances to it, how it was built and things like that. But it actually was used in anger. It was fired. You could say it was used in anger. It was fired at the Confederates when they occupied Norfolk, and it was kind of a ranging shot. Hey, let's just let the Confederates know that this big cannon, we can put a shell or a solid shot anywhere around there if they get us upset. And so it's kind of, that. They also had a rifled version of that same gun. They did the same thing, did a ranging shot. And those are some of the few actual shots in the war fired by Rodman guns. I've traced it back. I can count them on one hand, the number of times Rodman guns were actually fired towards the Confederacy. And every time they were ranging shots. They never really fired them at the Confederates. They were just making sure the Confederates knew they had the range to get there.
How about that? It's a fascinating gun. I like.
But it was the most
being-
expensive cannon produced in the Civil War. I have a chart somewhere that I've put out that of all of the expenditures by the federal government on cannons during the Civil War, roughly a third of it was spent on Rodman cannons, and yet they fire 5 shots.
Wow, that's crazy. Okay, let's see. Another question is, this is actually my question. Give us some examples of the most destructive single artillery shells fired, the ones that took out the most men with a single shell.
Okay. Probably the most destructive shot, Laura, we were discussing this earlier, is at the Battle of St. Charles in Arkansas on the White River. One shot, and you hear was it solid shot? Was it shell? Well, it was fired from a banded and rifled an old Seacoast gun that had been banded and rifled. And typically those did not fire solid shot because the weight of a solid shot, and in order to get past the inertia of moving that solid shot, you needed a lot of powder. And those guns were, iffy at best, modified gun with the banding. And so I tend to think it was actually a shell that didn't go off instead of a solid shot. But this one shot passed through an open gun port in the USS Mound City and directly hits the boiler in the Mound City. So it doesn't blow up. It's not the concussive effect or bursting effect. It's the fact that it hits the boiler and sprays scalding hot steam across the entire ship. Off the top of my head, I can't remember how many men, but I think that the ratio was one of those. They typically had 350 or so men on those ships, on those ironclads. And most of over half of the crew is killed and wounded right off the bat. That ironclad is completely taken out of action because of that one shot. And if I go back and say, well, what was the best shot of the Civil War? That's either the luckiest or the best aim, depends on how you want to consider it.
Wow, fascinating. Let's see. Okay, this question's about Shiloh. A federal soldier wrote, found 5 Confederates behind a tree killed by one round, which went through them from low to high. Do you know what battery fired that shot?
I do not know. I can remember that story when I was a young Boy Scout doing the Shiloh Artillery Trail, that story was circulating around. Over the years, I've kind of, I don't want to say it's one of those stories, but it's always one of those, I heard it from a friend, and when you you narrow it down to, you can't really pin it down to this guy heard this, and this is what, somebody saw this. So it's hard to say when and where that occurred, because I've heard it attributed to different authors at different times, or different sources at different times.
Yeah. Okay. Mr. Fisher asks, and this is going to be a head scratcher for us all. Despite some reforms during the war, artillery of the Confederate Army of Tennessee never achieved the level of organization and tactical sophistication of the Army of Northern Virginia. What do you believe were the key reasons for that?
There's a well-written book out there. Was it Cannoneers in Gray? I believe, is that Larry Daniels? I've got it here behind me somewhere. Cannoneers in Gray, that covers that at book treatment. I could not do any better than that here. I'll give you the short answer here on this. It in my opinion, it boils down to leadership. The Army of Tennessee kind of gets shorted on leadership, and as far as artillerists, some of the guys that rise to the top, Felix Robertson is a good example, who's for a period of time as chief of artillery, I believe under Bragg, if I've got my time periods right, under Bragg. And he is just not a good artillerist. When he's a battery commander at Shiloh, he goes into action with brand new Napoleons that had been, Confederate Napoleons that have just been produced. So he's got the most powerful battery on the field for the Confederates. He goes into action. He's part of that mass that we call Ruggles Battery. He goes into action. They fire a few rounds, and he says, "Oh, I don't want to risk my guns here." And if you go there today and you look for his battery position, it's off the line. It's behind the line, because he withdrew. He withdrew, and he said, "All right, my gunners we can engage leisurely from here." And while a whole battle's going on, you're a battery commander that takes it on your own to pull back. To me, that tells me something about what's going on in the mindset of that commander. And I hesitate to say bad things about a commander, because you've got to judge them. In my opinion, you've always got to judge them based on the situation that they face. But in the case of Felix Robertson, I see bad administrative decisions. I see bad, in some cases he would deliberately favor one battery over another because he didn't like a commander or didn't like a unit or something. And those are bad traits for an artillery, an army artillery chief. And consequently, you're not supporting your army commander. Another example where the Army of Tennessee, get it right here, Army of Tennessee got kind of shorted late in the war. You have Beckham is transferred to be their chief of artillery, and he's a very capable artillery officer and does a lot of good work. Hey, Beckham. I think I got my names wrong there. Any rate, but he is killed in action in the artillery engagement there at Columbia, Tennessee. And it's very telling that instead of being the guy who pulls John Bell Hood aside at Franklin and said, "Hey, boss, we might want to get artillery to support this charge," instead, he's mortally wounded the day prior, and he's not able to provide that advice. And so you see this happening time and time again, that the Army of Tennessee's artillerists are shorted on they don't have that Henry Hunt or even a Pelham to come forward and kind of lead that and shape that artillery. And I think that's where the failing is.
Thank you very much. Let's see, we're going to go to a couple more live questions. Some folks had another live question to ask, so we're going to go to those.
Sure.
Mr. Verosco has another question.
Yeah, this one is a little bit more technical. So your blog covers, did a really great series on the evolution of field artillery that was iron and the iron 6-pounders. But I've always wondered about the reputation of the 6-pounder walking stick, the early one, the model 1819 to 1822 one, and its reputation for bursting, because it's often said that that was due to the design of the gun having too thin of metal at the breech. But it seems to me that according to what you say in your blog about elsewhere in your blog about the problems that the pre-war army had with getting really good iron, that it was always like brittle, and basically they were casting it the wrong way because of the hot blast thing. It's always seemed to me that it wouldn't it have been the hot blast iron that was causing the bursting sting and not the design of the gun itself, because they go to a stubbier design of cannon after that particular model, and it doesn't seem to really cure the bursting problem all that much.
Yep. In fact, and that's you're on the right track there, but it's one of those that the only way that we could really prove that would be to either cast a cannon today that is exactly with the same ratio and the same mixture, the exact same construction techniques and casting techniques, and then go test it. Or we need to take some of the surviving guns and go test them. I don't recommend the latter. The former is probably next to impossible because, again, this was in the days before, you know, the detailed scientific notes that we often see now associated with metallurgy and such. But what you're referring to, the folks that may be unfamiliar with it, what happens with iron founding from the 1700s into the 1800s is there's a kind of a shift as they begin to change the way that the iron as it's being smelted. And the change in the techniques mean that more carbon is introduced to the iron. And as it is, that's great if you're building a lighthouse and you need a strong iron support, or you're building a house and you need iron structure to supplement the wood and whatnot like that. It's great. But if you're designing a cannon, you need different metal properties. And at the time, it wasn't picked up on until on this side of the Atlantic, the U.S. Army did a whole series of experiments about this, about the tensile strength of metal. And on the European side, of course, there were a lot of other ordnance officers over there, many more doing it. But on our American side, I would say this: if you go out to, especially some of the Seacoast guns, and you go out and you're looking at them today, sometimes you'll see little divots in the muzzle, or you'll see a divot taken out of the cascabel, or even the trunnion, a little circle cut out of the trunnion. And those were part of those experiments by the U.S. Army. They went to the cannon that seemed to be working best in terms of, you know, like they knew, hey, we got a lot from, say, West Point Foundry, and these cannon are very durable. They would go out and they would test those and they would take a sample of the metal from a non-important or non-critical part of the gun and test the tensile strength. And this fed into the test that Rodman was doing with tensile strength of metal and working towards the design of the Rodman gun. So it all kind of had a cumulative effect. But I think in my opinion, you're spot on that it was the casting techniques of those guns that made them more brittle. The walking stick itself, it just as the name implies, it was a 6-pounder gun, but it was very much longer than its contemporaries. As the Americans were trying, there was an early experiment with, we want to get the most mobile gun, but with the most range out of it, is what they were trying to achieve. And unfortunately, because of the design of it, it was not, they had to think about it a little bit seriously about it before they fired it, because you didn't want to overload that charge.
Thank you so much. We've got another live question waiting for you there. Go ahead, Tina.
I have a question about rifling, and how did they discover rifling created a more accurate shot versus a smoothbore? I mean, like, how did that idea come up, and what time in history did it become the standard, and how long did it take for the Federals and the CSA to implement it?
Okay. Rifling is actually, it's very ancient. Early on in the gunpowder era, it was determined, hey, if you put some spin on that projectile, it has more, a little bit more accuracy. And so it was known. The problem had always been, how do you make that uniform? How do you actually get that, have a cannon construction technique where you can make that work every time? And again, bear in mind, in the ancient periods up until the mid 1700s, when you made a cannon, those were always one-off productions. Almost, well, not always, but almost always. They had patterns, but especially since they're being sold to independent companies, they weren't so they wanted a gun for them, not necessarily a gun that matched the King's measure or the Napoleon's measure, and so rifling didn't come into favor because it was very difficult to apply. It was to make it uniform, and it needed special projectiles. Rifling does not become feasible, in my opinion, doesn't become feasible for mass production until 1840s, 1850s, when you have designers not only looking at the gun itself, but looking at the projectile. And here on our side of the Atlantic, you've got folks designing James shells and later Parrott and Reed and some of the others coming up with the ideas of having that soft metal, the Parrott and the Reeds, a soft metal base that as it's fired, it expands and seals off to take to the rifling. And that was really the key part, because if you just shove a smoothbore projectile or a round shot down a rifled gun, there's nothing to make it take to the rifling, nothing that makes it adhere to the rifling and get that spin. But if you build a projectile that has that, what they call sabot, I'm sorry, I'm old Army gunner from the tank days.
I know what that is, actually. I know what that is.
Yeah, but I tend to call it sabot, but it's a sabot is what they would call it. That would take to the rifling. Different techniques. James had a different technique. Hotchkiss, Schenkel, all had different techniques to make that happen. But until you had a projectile that could take to the rifling, you can't impart that spin accurately or consistently and get the accuracy and the performance you want out of the rifle. So that had to evolve, and that was part of that. What happened in the 1850s? I gave it short notice here in this presentation. It deserves more. I'll say that. But that takes hold after the Civil War. The Americans continue to debate among artillerists, which is better, smoothbore or rifle. Even in Europe, even Franco-Prussian War, you still see a significant amount of smoothbores being used. But the French had already, on their mind, decided rifles are better. They would take most of their Napoleons. They actually rifled them. The system is called Lahite. My French is bad. LA space HITE. You can still find them out there today, out there about. And in fact, we captured a bunch of guns that were rifled that way from the Spanish during the Spanish-American War, and they're all over our military installations as trophies, by the way. You'll find them all over the place. It's kind of a neat tidbit there. But they started rifling their bronze guns, and it was kind of similar to our James rifling. And they found out real quick, well, they wear out. And consequently, you don't see a lot of original French Napoleons about in the museums anymore because they used them and wore them out. After that, though, everybody says, you know what, rifling, because I can get now the range I can really take advantage of, because now I've got technology, the telegraph and later the radio, that I can air that gun out. I can have it fire at extremely long ranges, and somebody can call me and tell me you were short, you were long, left or right or whatever, and and now you want to use the rifle for that increased range. Add to that the recoil system, so now every time you fire the gun, you don't have to go remeasure and put it back into place. You fire it, it stays in one place. And now you've got the French model 1897, the famous French 75 from World War I, and they could sit there and fire that gun all day. It would never move, and they could just keep pouring shot and shell on a target. That's what it really took for rifling to become the predominant form on the, as far as cannon. I would say this: when I went to war, I used a smoothbore. It was a smoothbore gun in my tank, my M1A1 tank, smoothbore. Why is that? Because it had fin stabilized projectiles, because now we have computers that can better predict where that round is going to land. And we got fin stabilized projectiles that can, that my laser guided computer or my laser pointer can pinpoint that target, get the range. I don't even have to compute it, and plug it into that computer and say, make that round hit that target. Smoothbore does that much better than a rifle in that particular case.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Let's see. The next question is from Mr. Pellegrini, who asks, could you give us a brief description of flying artillery?
How you doing there? flying artillery, I had a note in this in the beginning. I was going to mention it. I said, it's already going too long. And so I kind of cut it out.
Maybe you'll come
Civil-
back and do a whole program
Yeah.
for us on flying artillery.
I would bore you guys to death. Before the Civil War, you see names applied to field artillery. You hear foot artillery, mounted artillery, horse artillery, flying artillery. What we're supposed to say is, oh, there's a great distinction there. Okay, foot artillery is basically artillerists that they don't ride on the horses or on the limbers or such. They walk behind the artillery. Okay, that's a very rudimentary decision, but it was supposed to be the standard artillery. The Americans never really liked that ideal because artillery in their mind should be highly mobile. And so most American application of field artillery tended to the what they call the mounted artillery. Okay, this means the artillerists can ride on the horses or ride on the ammunition chest to get around the battlefield a lot quicker. And not that greatly quicker, but still not as fast as cavalry, but they're still faster than marching infantry. And that's your mounted artillery. Horse artillery is adding a couple more horses to that so it can move faster. Flying artillery, it was more so kind of it's kind of a branding, if you will. The notion is I need artillery that I can rapidly move around the battlefield. Well, in the European context, that meant something because their artillery, they weren't organized the way the Americans were, optimizing for rapid movement. The Americans arguably already had flying artillery, and the use of it was kind of debranded, especially before the war. If I'm going to start a militia battery, I don't want to just call it, I've got some foot artillery. We're the Craig Swain's foot artillery of Leesburg, Virginia. I won't get very many recruits. But if I call it the flying artillery of Leesburg, Virginia, everybody and their brother will want to join up because it's cool. Okay. Once we get into the Civil War, the distinction between foot artillery, take that one away. That we never use that truly use that in the Civil War. But mounted artillery, that's the predominant form. Horse artillery, the real difference there is that they added a couple horses. It is really what it boils down to. The tactics, where you place the artillery, how you employ it, is the same. And flying artillery, it's just the branding, and we see that drop away early in the war. You're artillery, you're an artillery battery. Come out here and do artillery things.
So they didn't have special T-shirts or anything?
Not doctrinally, no. It was great for recruiting, though.
It would be. Mr. Salehorse asked, he's asking for clarification on the ratio thing that you talked about, and he asks, explain Braxton Bragg's use of ratio based on battery per brigade. For example, each brigade had a battery with it, if he's understanding that correctly.
Yes, that was kind of the early setup. Again, the Confederate Army in the West not yet getting in line with some of the refinements, the true American doctrine. You saw this early on in the Army of the Potomac, Army of Northern Virginia, where the Confederates very early on, that you think about it this way, you'd have something like Cobb's Legion or Hampton's Legion show up in Richmond, and you've got an artillery battery, maybe a cavalry regiment, and a infantry regiment all marching together. No. They would break that up and say, well, Hampton's artillery will go over here and be in the artillery of this division, or whatever division it is. The cavalry go to a cavalry assignment, cavalry division, and the infantry will go over here to an infantry brigade. And they broke those up very early on in here in the Eastern Theater. In the Western Theater, a lot of that persisted much, well into midway through the war, that you would have an assignment of a battery to a brigade. A lot of times you would have a commander who had a previous association with that battery. Maybe he helped raise that battery alongside his infantry, and he wanted to keep them close by. And it was very hard, again, because go back to what we mentioned before, that in the Western Theater, the Confederates didn't have a lot of great artillery leadership. They didn't have an officer who would go in and say, hey, look, Braxton Bragg, it's wrong for you to keep that battery down there at the brigade level because we're not able to achieve the mass at the divisional, or better yet, the corps and army level. We're not able to mass those batteries. and it wasn't there to fight for a concentration of artillery. Early war battles, think about, I have a slide that I pulled out of there just for brevity about Shiloh and Ruggles Battery, that no, it wasn't a hub to hub massing of those guns. I mean, what we see on the field today, that display, it's awesome. I love it to walk down that line, but it's completely inaccurate because those batteries didn't all go into line together. They weren't concentrated. There wasn't an artillerist running around saying, telling them what to aim at, how to adjust their fires and trying to concentrate them. Instead, it was an officers, Confederate officers running around the battlefield saying, hey, grab that battery, tell them to come over here. And in some cases, they would have arguments with the brigade commander. Well, that's my battery. Don't move my battery. No, I need it over here because this is where the Federals are. We need to get our guns here. And all of this is going on to achieve that. What occurs there, what we call Ruggles Battery, it really wasn't a set battery. And that's the misgivings or the pitfall or the failings there of the Confederate Artillery Command in the West, in my opinion, that you don't have that one voice that would go in there and say, we need a mass battery here to pummel this Federal position in the sunken road. I'm going to go out and pull these batteries from all these brigades and force them into this one mass battery. No one had that authority. And that's, Bragg is keeping to that mindset well into the war, when arguably, had he adopted something in line with what the Army of Northern Virginia did, better yet, what the Army of the Potomac had done, Chickamauga, he would have saw a better use of his artillery. As it was, there's some great moments on the field where the Confederate artillery overpowers Federal salients and such, and it does great things. But it's singular. It's not coordinated across the Army.
I see. I think that probably addressed his question because I even understood it. So it must have. And then our last comment is really just a comment. It's talking about the damage at Fort Pulaski and how that pretty much eliminated the effectiveness. Shelling that spot from a distance, pretty much, yeah.
That is and that it's outside the scope of field artillery.
Base strength fortifications and rifle guns is what he's basically going at.
Yeah. The caveat I would always put on that is I put up the slide there, said, hey, rifles versus smoothbores field artillery, there's a give and take there. There's a reason to have both types present because the advantages, disadvantages. If we get into siege, garrison, and seacoast defense, I'll make the opposite case, that you wanted to have rifled guns or extremely large caliber smoothbore guns to compensate for the disadvantages of the smoothbore guns. But you really, in the Civil War era, you wanted to get rifled guns because you needed the rifling. If you're going to lay siege to Fort Pulaski, you need rifles. You've got to have rifles. The Fort Sumter was effectively reduced from a third system seacoast defense, a world-class seacoast defense, all the way down to an infantry outpost over the span of a few months by rifled artillery fire. Just completely reduced it down to an infantry outpost. It was still effective, but only as an infantry outpost. It wasn't able to repel any of the Federal ironclads. Now that role had to shift across the mouth of the harbor over to Fort Moultrie and the associated defenses on Sullivan's Island. So rifled artillery in siege and garrison and seacoast defense, it comes to the fore. And unfortunately, we Americans, due to economy, are very slow to adopt those. It's not until the Endicott era, much later in the 19th century, that we really get on the bandwagon with rifled artillery for seacoast defense. But it's a completely different story than what we have here for field artillery.
Thank you so much. This was a fascinating presentation, and we appreciate you answering all the questions. And the presentation also was wonderful. And like I said, answering everyone's questions. And also thank you to everyone who submitted those questions. They were wonderful. We would like to remind, speaking of Ruggles Battery, there you go. We would like to remind everyone that our guests, they provide these presentations without compensation. So we always encourage folks to buy their books or take advantage of their services, support them in any way that you can. And we would like to do that here tonight and let you know that our guest, Mr. Swain, has the award-winning blog To the Sound of the Guns. If you've ever done any artillery-related research on the internet and done a search, it's going to pop up in your results. I know it has in mine. And you'll find material there covering various aspects of the war, but with a focus on artillery and the Charleston theater of war. Go to markerhunter.wordpress.com and check it out. If your group's looking for a speaker, you can complete a request form right there on the site. Look for the Book Me button. And if you're in need of boots on the ground guide services, I can't think of anyone who would be more energetic than Mr. Swain. I know it would be wonderful. And he can help you at First Manassas, Brandy Station, Edwards Ferry, which is part of the Gettysburg campaign, Kelly's Ford, Charleston, or Savannah. You can use that same contact form on his website to make those arrangements. And Mr. Swain always encourages everyone to make donations to your favorite preservation effort. Many thanks to Mr. Swain tonight for being with us. It was a fantastic program and we enjoyed having you so much. Thank you very much. It was awesome. I learned a ton. Next week on Civil War Talk Presents, we have January 19th. Don't miss it. Living Shadows of a Passing Time. Our friend Ron Coddington, editor and publisher of Military Images, will be back with us. This time he's going to bring a panel of 9 premier image collectors, and each one has selected their favorite image. Not an easy task for some of these folks who are veteran image collectors and have large collections. He'll be bringing Michelle Behan, Rick Brown, Kevin Canberg, Ron Field, Adam Fleischer, Paul Hoza, Mike Houston, Kurt Luther from the Photo Sleuth website, and David Wynn Vaughn, who has a Georgia collection. They're sure to bring some fantastic images, and our last image collector showcase back in July filled immediately as soon as we posted it, almost. So it's already posted, so be sure to go ahead and register early, and remember the seating is limited. On February 2nd, we're going to have the first of a series of Savas Beatty authors with us. They've just released several new books from Savas Beatty, and this is the first one from that series. Michael E. Block will be here to talk about his new book, The Carnage Was Fearful, The Battle of Cedar Mountain, August 9th, 1862. It's brand new and part of Savas Beatty's Emerging Civil War series. And on February 9th, you won't want to miss Sarah K. Byerly on her new book, Call Out the Cadets, The Battle of New Market, May 15th, 1864, also part of Savas Beatty's Emerging Civil War series. And we are very much looking forward to hosting her. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you on Wednesday, January 19th at 8:30 for that fantastic collector showcase with Living Shadows of the Passing Time with our friend Ron Coddington from Military Images, and 9 of those collectors who will bring their images to tell us the stories behind those faces. Many thanks again to Mr. Swain for being with us tonight, and we will see you next week on January 19th.